This theory builds off Ken Wilber's theory, in particular the quadrants. Here we see a hexagonal shape. You'll find out more later. At this point, please note that there is a developmental process that takes place through all 6 of these points. The first point is considered the physical, or the Physio Sphere. It's in some ways proto-perspectival. Notice that it hovers neither in the individualist or collective space. It is in between. The Physio Sphere is only one name that will be fractured into many different terms that suggest a very similar thing. Initially, this term will look a little clumsy, but I hope to show you why it's being used in this particular circumstance. Next, we move to vital energy. This can be seen in vital life, such as plants. Notice, to the best of our knowledge, physical existence happened first, and then vital life thereafter. Although these aren't considered part of Ken Wilber's quadrant theory, they are essential to his theory in general. That is to say that he includes vital life and the Physio Sphere into his broad spectrum of consciousness. Notice also that I emphasize energy here, because I think it is very much in play as to what the next step up in the developmental context is related to. Something I've sort of already said, vital life transcends and includes the Physio Sphere, so it relies on it for its existence. Now we're going to bring in the other quadrants. I'm going to show you a little bit more of how this process goes. So it goes again from the physical to vital energy. This monumental leap took place many millions of years ago. You might have noticed that I've color-coded these. It's pointing to a fractal dynamic that I'm talking about in this developmental process. It's related in particular to spiral dynamics, as I think it's the clearest view as to how this 6-on-6 dynamic is actually working. The movement into I can be seen as a sort of consciousness awakening process. In early evolution, we see it in reptiles, and in later evolution in red in spiral dynamics. Blue's primary focus tends to be social relationships, how others see me, and how I fit within a group. Although all of these are ever arising, the primary focus is shifting from one to the next. A refraction of this can be seen in the movement from reptiles into mammals. Another more monumental movement is the transition from mammals into tool-making humans, where we use our complex rind, our neocortex, to build complicated tools in sort of the it domain, as it were. Later, as humans advanced, orange came online as proper engineers of tools. This next one's a little hard to explain because it revolves around pattern recognition, which I'm going to argue is in some ways just emergent. Although we can see it in sort of the green context, it tends to be reductionist. It focuses just on its and not on the other domains very much. But in a broader sense, it's more than that, and I'll explain it later. So you might have noticed that this is an attempt at sort of integrating Ken Wilber's quadrant theory with his developmental theory. So typically they're not integrated, so that's part of what's happening here. I'm further going to posit that there is a degree of integration of even states of consciousness, so let's start with that. So with beige, there seems to be a very deep focus with survival, and I'd argue yellow as well. Yellow on a planetary scale, there's a lot of crisis that are emerging on a planetary scale, so that's kind of the existential quality. You see the existentialists emerge with yellow, so we can kind of broadly consider it sort of an existentialism. And what I'm going to argue for the purple or turquoise stage is kind of this sense in which there's these energies, these subtle energies, and they're coming into play at that point. Broadly speaking, you can consider it sort of shamanism versus neo-shamanism. The next step is kind of focusing on I or powers or these sorts of siddhis and these sorts of things. So I would broadly consider it sort of a yogic path. Beyond that, we're moving into something more saintly, where people are caring for others. There's this notion of sort of transcendence, of going beyond ourselves through others, through the care and compassion of others. This gets into a bit of a speculative domain, but some would say that there is a degree even beyond sort of saintly orientation that is sort of sagely, it's sort of enlightened, it's sort of radically clear wisdom of the transcendent nature of Godhead. And lastly, there might be this sort of non-dualist one-taste reality in which all states are awakened to, you're conscious through all states of consciousness, all potentials of existence, and so forth. As Ken often says, this is sort of a map of the prison potentially. In other words, we would kind of sort of in an I state, although all of these focuses are shifted through all the time. But the transcendent movement to we would be the next step, potentially. What I mean by that is that as an I could enter into a we communion while still maintaining my I, but in a we context at a higher order. I said I'd come back to its, and it's kind of the crux of this argument. It's the relationship between its and integration. Now, typically we consider Green to be reductionist, and I think rightfully so. I'm going to argue that its is still a primary focus within the integral tier, which would be sort of that sixth tier that we go through in this pattern. Its is sort of emergent. We haven't really seen its full expression, and what I kind of think is going to happen with it is the integration of the technology that we made in the it tier stage to integrate it into our bodies as sort of cyborgs, for better or worse.